All right, everyone, yet another Biden video. Again, it's a lot to keep up with the scandals, the gaffes, and the poopy pants moments with Beijing Biden, but we'll try to cover as much as we can because there are other more interesting things to speak of sometimes. The other day, Joe Biden decided to address assault weapons, which the AR-15's not one, but in the colloquial usage of the left, they just use the outdated terminology that originally was meant to brand merchandise more than anything and has absolutely nothing to do with the functionality of these weapons. He's doubled down on that tough guy shtick that he did like a year ago. He's like, well, if you want to take on the U.S. government, you're going to need more than your pea shooters. He's basically doing that again. Link in the description. It's a video clip, so it's not archived. He's like, well, if you want to take on the U.S. government, you're not going to need an AR-15. You need F-15s, which I believe is mainly an air-to-air plane, actually. So why don't you threaten people with A-10s and compare it to the AR-10? Or so that would be a little bit more apt because, most people do not want to be attacked by an A-10. I mean, so yeah. Why don't you make that comparison, something that's at least, vaguely apt instead of going off into La La Land? I'm surprised you didn't start talking about Hellcat fighters. my flying fortress is going to get you. We've got biplanes in the U.S. Military, so watch out. We'll drop dynamite on your heads. Surprised he didn't revert to like when he was a kid. He's watching some World War I movie with his dad, which is reasonably recent history. Plenty of veterans still left alive. I'm imagining Joe Biden in the 1940s. He's on the corner with the town drunk who fought in the Spanish-American War, listening to all of his drunken war stories and shit like that. Anyway, the tough guy's shtick falls flat in several ways. Now, we've already discussed one of these manners. Of course, the U.S. military, number one, you'd have mass defections if you tried to deploy them on U.S. soil for any purpose. So that would be problematic. In a hyper-politicized climate, which you've got, you'd probably have numerous state-run guard aspects defecting as well. It'd be like a patchwork country that would be constantly arming up. A lot of people wouldn't support either side. It'd be like every other struggle in history. Most people would sit on the fence. They wouldn't have a problem with anyone. They're like, just leave me alone. That's 80% of the population usually. By the way, I would point out in the U.S. Revolution, it was a very, very small proportion of the population that ever did jack shit. Most people just stayed at home. They went cod fishing. They farmed their hay, etc., etc. They're too busy, shooting at Indians or whatever, cutting down trees and doing normal 1700s bullshit. Most of them were not hardline Tories, except for trade purposes in New England, actually, nor were they revolutionaries, although there were auxiliary groups that kind of milled about on the fringes of both. Pirates enjoyed the situation. That could be quite lucrative. Hey, all of a sudden, there's all these really, really rich British people, these generals coming over, and maybe we can pick one of these ships off. Oh, they're in a convoy? Well, we'll save it for another time. We'll go on a night raid with our sloop or something like that, drag the ship off. Here's the thing, though. Number one, the U.S. military does not fare well against partisan fighting, especially on its own soil, where you can't deploy a lot of the toys that you've deployed in other places. It would cause mass civilian damage. And the problem with causing that is that then more and more people would rise up against you. Yes, using your AR-15 would be perfectly fine if your intent is sabotage or something like that. If you're going full Taliban mode, we've seen what can be done against a standing symmetrical military force. This is the case with more than the U.S., by the way. Russia is having problems right now with a force in Ukraine that is partially comprised of civilian partisans. They are not necessarily fully trained for combat. Some of these people are saboteurs, etc. China had this problem twice when it tried to invade Vietnam. We had the same problem as well. This was a problem for NATO and U.S. forces in Korea, etc., etc. You've got relatively poorly trained, relatively poorly equipped people, but they're fighting on their own territory. You're playing by rules that they're not necessarily playing by, and they have the ability in general to blend in with the local population. You get an area in Ukraine where everyone's speaking Russian anyway. It might be kind of difficult for the Russian soldiers to tell who's who. The same in Korea, the same in Vietnam. The same would be true community to community in the U.S. It would also be, we would also be reticent if we didn't mention Afghanistan, where the Taliban managed to hold out for 20 goddamn years. Not a large number of Taliban members, and yes, again, there are auxiliary groups that were on the fringes of their ideology, sort of parlaying diplomatically, etc. They managed to hold out, and most of them were using lightly armored pickup trucks and AK-47s. That was the bulk of their capabilities. That and rudimentary IEDs, things of that nature. You're not talking about sophisticated weapons generally. You got a lot of last-gen weaponry. It's pumped into the region at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s when they were fighting the Soviets. You got some captured Soviet missiles and shit like that, but, you know, it's 40 fucking years old. It doesn't exactly stand up necessarily to modern scrutiny. These forces over and over and over again have no problem, as long as they're on their own territory, resisting symmetrical forces. And the fact is that when that symmetrical force is also based in the same territory, the soldiers would be a little bit on the reluctant side, I think, to fire on the average civilian. Most in the end would follow orders. Some would not. And some of those people would be top brass, just to be clear. You could end up with a situation where some top-level general decides to defect and take his toys with him simply because he wants to establish himself in a position of power. That would be actually the more concerning possible route, just to be clear. This tough guy shtick doesn't impress anyone. By the way, nobody's attempting to rise up against the U.S. government anyway. People are generally reluctant to do things like that. They tend to be rather patient, long-suffering, and pacifistic. That's why you have 100+ million people owning guns in the United States, and with the exception of handgun-related gang crime in blighted inner cities, you have relatively little actual gun violence in the U.S. If you're talking about gun deaths, you can inflate that number, but then you have to explain to people that half of them are accidental or suicide-related. If you're looking at actual offensive gun crime, most parts of the U.S. are as safe as goddamn Switzerland. Joe Biden's insinuation that gun owners, they're clinging to their guns and Bibles and they're trying to prepare to take over the gun, but we're going to beat them up real good. Nobody's trying to beat you up, Joe. I mean, you lose against the breeze going up the stairs of Air Force One. Nobody's concerned about you. Huh? Nobody feels intimidated when you challenge them to a push-up contest, or when you say, I don't work for you, or one of your other out-of-touch statements, or your wife's out-of-touch statements about breakfast tacos. Nobody's concerned about you doing anything that's particularly violent towards the population. We're much more worried about you causing a depression or something like that, I think, in general. Even though Joe Biden would love to fry a bunch of people, he's one of those old warmongers. He's basically like a more low-key John McCain anyway. Even though he'd find that funny, the gumption just ain't there. You know, he used to be able to beat off to pictures of charred bodies. Now he can't get it up even with Viagra, so he's like, fuck it. I guess I won't start this war, you know. I know that the shareholders want it, but what am I getting out of it after all? That's about all. Peace out.